Recently, the ONS produced a long-term forecast for spending and taxation. It makes for grim reading. Assuming policy doesn't change, UK debt will rise to a level last seen in the Napoleonic Wars. And this forecast also assumes there won't be any external shocks like COVID or a Ukraine war. And of course, there will be some kind of shocks in the future. So bond investors warn that with rising debt, we're at risk of rising gilt yields. And any further rise in debt could trigger a Truss-style meltdown. Even Labour ministers started to defend the winter fuel cuts on the grounds that we have to worry about the bond market. So does this mean we have no alternative but more austerity? Well, firstly, we have to be wary of placing too much emphasis on the opinion of bond investors. As the Financial Times notes, bond investors can financially benefit from austerity. Austerity caused gilt yields to fall and bond prices to rise. Bond investors are one of the few groups who benefit from a stagnating economy. Strong economic growth can paradoxically cause bondholders to lose value. But how do you deal with the current situation of high debt and low growth? How can you reduce debt without causing lower economic growth like the 2010s? Arguably, this is the wrong question to ask. A better question to ask is, how can we achieve sufficient economic growth to be able to reduce debt? After the First World War, the UK government imposed austerity on public spending, and combined with an overvalued exchange rate, it caused high unemployment, deflation, and public debt only fell slowly despite running primary budget surpluses. After the Second World War, debt was even higher, but rather than panic and cut spending, the government invested in health, housing and the welfare state. The strong economic growth of the post-war period enabled debt to fall, and this is a really important lesson to learn. The Truss debacle definitely affects Labour's thinking. Their worst nightmare has been tarnished with the same brush of economic incompetence. But it's important not to draw the wrong lessons from that mini-budget. At the time of the Truss budget, inflation was 10% and interest rates were rising rapidly around the world. The $100 billion splurge of unfunded tax cuts were inflationary and very badly timed. But although the present government inherit very difficult public finances, the economy is doing much better than it was in that time. Inflation has fallen below 2% and interest rates are set to fall. And this decline in inflation is a real lifeline for the current Chancellor. Also, never forget that debt to GDP only tells part of a story. As I mentioned before, Japan, debt of over 250% of GDP, but bond yields of less than 1%. High debt is not necessarily the end of the world. From 1997 to 2022, Argentinian debt averaged around 68%, yet they've defaulted 5 times in the past 90 years or so. It also depends which measure of debt that you use. Now, an interesting concept is public sector net worth. This attempts to look at both liabilities and also assets of a country. For example, if you borrowed to fund pension benefits, then public sector net worth would fall because you get more liabilities, more spending, but you don't get any investment or assets as a result of that. And this makes that borrowing much more unsustainable. But if you borrow to fund capital investment, increasing the stock of roads, hospitals, schools, then public sector net worth actually increases, because after the investment, the assets and potential future tax revenues become greater. And this is why not all fund managers worry about borrowing for investment. Investment in capital stock increases the future capacity of the economy. It means that future tax revenue will be able to pay debt interest payments. Now, if we go back to the question, is the UK broke? The real problem is a lack of capital investment. Since 1990, UK investment has been 3 percentage points below the OECD average, a gap of around 25 billion a year. A report by EY put the UK's capital gap at around 1.6 trillion. Yet public sector investment is forecast to continue falling to just 1.7% of GDP in the next 5 years. Yet under current fiscal rules, investment that increases illiquid assets like housing and school does not help with your debt target because illiquid assets are not counted. And this is one reason why chancellors have often cut public investment. It's the easiest way to meet debt rules. The OBR claim a permanent 1% increase in public investment increases potential output 0.5% in 5 years and 2% in 10 years. So the return from investment is greater than the borrowing costs. A better question to ask is, can the UK afford not to invest at the moment? Underinvestment can actually be quite expensive. We saw with high energy prices causing pain for business and households. Even something as simple as fixing potholes can cost £14 billion in repairs, accidents and time wasted. Austerity can be expensive. Now, another perspective on UK debt is from the MMT school of thought that the UK can never go broke because it has its own currency, and the Bank of England has the ability to create as much money as it wants and fund government spending either directly or indirectly through some kind of reformed quantitative easing. Now, this is true to some extent. The Bank of England can create money. But if we have a magic money tree, this magic money tree can also give an unwanted gift of inflation. Now, in the 2010s, inflation was very low, and we did actually finance government debt through quantitative easing, and it didn't really cause inflation. But with inflation's return, there's very limited scope for being able to increase the money supply without starting to cause inflation. It's not a sustainable way to maintain current spending. Basically, inflation is always going to be a constraint on both borrowing and money creation, which is why the recent fall in inflation is definitely welcome news for the Chancellor. But how sustainable will that fall in inflation be? There's no guarantee that suddenly inflation's all over. Now, the government are likely to reform fiscal rules to allow more borrowing for investment, but try to fund current spending through current tax revenues. And that definitely has a certain logic. But it does still mean that we face the prospect of austerity in many government departments. The problem is that the current government accepted the past unsustainable national insurance cuts and ruled out any major tax rises. So they have to scrabble around for tax revenue from things like capital gains and inheritance tax. But it is tricky to raise substantial sums from these taxes. You never really know how much you're going to get. The government have inherited a bad fiscal situation. The last budgets assumed real cuts in many government departments. No wonder ministers are currently starting to panic about the spending cuts they'll have to find. Now, in 2010, there may have been some fat left to trim from government budgets, but today there really isn't. Many unprotected departments have seen very big cuts in the past 14 years. Housing, education, justice system. The crumbling legal system really needs a big injection of cash, not more austerity. Healthcare system, despite getting spending rises, has near record level waiting lists. But demand is only expected to continue growing in the coming years, due to, of course, the ageing population, but also other factors like better treatments, more expensive treatments. As a share of GDP, healthcare will rise continually over the next few decades, and we can no longer accommodate higher health spending by cutting defence spending like we did in the post-war period. The big issue behind some of these dire forecasts for debt is that the UK population is ageing, and this will cause more pension spending. It's forecast to rise quite significantly. Amidst all the fury over the winter fuel allowance cuts, which saved a really quite small 1.5 billion, possibly less if people claim more benefits, due to the triple lock pension guarantee, pension benefits are forecast to rise by 4.1%, whereas working age benefits only 1.7%. So definitely those of working age relying on benefits will see very stagnant real incomes. In fact, the poorest 10% are expected to see falling real incomes in the coming years. Now, recently I made a video about reasons to be a bit more optimistic about the prospects of the UK economy. And there are signs that some things at least are starting to improve or could improve. But even the most optimistic growth forecasts at the moment are still fairly muted. Maybe 1.5% a year, 1.8% if we're lucky. And this is definitely better than stagnation. But for many households, they will see very little increase in real disposable income in the coming years. Housing costs continue to rise, benefits have been squeezed, and real wage growth is still limited. So overall, it's a mistake to cut back on investment to meet fiscal targets. This kind of austerity has definitely damaged the UK's long-term prospects, both from economic and social perspective. And it will be a mistake to keep repeating the same mistakes. But the unwelcome reality is that even if the economy marginally improves, public finances are in a bad shape. There's rising demand for government services, and they're rising faster than tax revenues. Therefore, many will continue to feel the continuation of austerity in some form because of fairly low real wage growth and cuts to certain departments. Is there any alternative to this? Well, in the long term, investment, planning reforms and other pro-growth measures can increase economic growth, giving chancellors more fiscal headroom, but that will take a long time to really have an effect. In the short term, if we want a bigger state to meet the growing demands of an ageing population, then you will also need higher taxes. So with this lingering austerity, how can we justify a more optimistic outlook for the UK economy? Now, this video shows some of the arguments for a bit more optimism, even if some are not particularly convincing and rather hopeful, but still worth trying to look on the bright side of life every now and then.